Good afternoon and welcome to Staying Up to Date with Internal Controls, a 2019 AIM webinar. This is Erin Jamison Koenig and thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, I would like to thank our Municipal Management Institute sponsor, Westler Engineering. AIM is excited to have Westler back for another year as the title sponsor for all AIM webinars and MMI educational events. Westler recognizes the importance of staying up to date with the most current laws, techniques, and issues around the state. This webinar is worth 1 MMI credit. We will note all participation and ensure that it counts towards your certification level. You do not need to fill out a form. As long as you stay logged in for the entire webinar, you will be given credit. A recorded link of the webinar and a copy of the presentation will be sent to all participants later this week. If you are having any technical difficulties during this webinar, please call our office at 317-237-6200 and tell them you are having trouble with the current webinar. Please note if the webinar audio cuts off suddenly and does not return, please hang up and dial back into the system using your telephone rather than the speakers on your computer. Due to the nature of webinars, your phone line is muted and you will not be able to ask questions verbally. However, there is a questions feature on the toolbar that should be appearing on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will answer questions at the end of the webinar. However, please note that there is a delay from the time you submit a question to the time we receive it. So please do not wait until the very end to submit your question. Today's webinar will be presented by Todd and Susan from the Indiana State Board of Accounts. Thank you both for presenting today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Erin, and welcome everyone. We're glad to have you with us as we talk about the exciting subject of internal controls. Everybody's favorite, I know. Wanted to first give you our contact information as we end. When we're done, if you need to contact us, you can email us or call that number. And the last slide, when we get to the end, will also have this information. So if you don't get it right now, that's fine. Today's topic is internal controls and staying up to date. So we're going to cover areas such as, Susan's going to start off with a discussion on the various components of internal control. Then I'll cover how to get started and creating an effective system of internal controls. We'll also cover how to handle situations where segregation of duties isn't fully possible due to the size of your unit and limited staff, and how you can compensate for not being able to segregate those duties. We'll briefly discuss what internal controls do and what they don't do. And then Susan will wrap up with a look at some case studies. We should also have time at the conclusion for some questions that you submitted, so we'll get to those toward the end. But for now, I'll turn it over to Susan.
Hi, everybody. To know how to effectively create an effective internal control system, you first need to understand what internal controls are and why they are important. Indiana Code 511-127 provides that internal control standards shall be defined to promote government accountability and transparency. Under that statute, the State Board of Accounts is required to define acceptable minimum level of internal control standards. To provide this guidance, the state examiner compiled the standards contained in the Uniform Internal Control Standards for Indiana Political Subdivisions, and that's also referred to as the Internal Controls Manual. All political subdivisions subject to audit by the State Board of Accounts are expected to adhere to these standards and will be evaluated accordingly in any audits that are performed either by or on behalf of the State Board of Accounts. So let's go through some of that information now. By necessity, the definition of internal control is broad. That's because each governmental unit is different, structured differently due to the size of staff, services provided, and varying objectives. It's a conceptual process that is applied to a wide range of situations in a wide range of environments. So the controls that you have could vary from your neighboring community simply because their environment may not be the same as yours. In the manual, we define internal controls as the process executed by officials and employees designed to provide reasonable assurance the mission and objectives of your city or town will be achieved. We also define it as a basic element fundamental to the municipality, and as an adaptable process meant to be designed to meet your needs and amended or changed as objectives and goals change over time. A system of internal control is focused on the achievement of objectives. In other words, those objectives are what you're trying to accomplish. From a financial aspect, cities and towns are most likely looking at how effective their financial operations are, how they can best report finances both externally and internally, and making sure that they comply with laws and regulations. An effective system of internal controls is dependent on you, the officials and employees at the unit, for implementation. You can have the best controls planned, but if they aren't put into motion, they won't be successful. Throughout this presentation, we will be referring to this manual, which is available on our website as shown. It has two main sections. Section 1 goes through a discussion of the 5 components of internal controls and the 17 principles that go along with those components. We will touch briefly on that today as an overview. Please consult Section 1 of this manual for more in-depth information. Section 2 of this manual contains the approved training materials. You should all be familiar with the video presentation, and the slides for that presentation are in Section 2. But also in Section 2 are examples of internal control procedures for some of the primary processes of receipts, disbursements, payroll, and credit card payments. We will touch on those today as well. The last section has some case studies you may be interested in reading at a later time. Before you can really start with establishing an internal control system, you need to know what your objectives are. After all, the internal control system is supposed to be designed so that your city or town can achieve those objectives. In general, objectives for political subdivisions originate from purposes and functions detailed in laws, regulations, and ordinances. Operations objectives relate to operational and performance goals, including the use of the city or town's resources. Reporting objectives consider the reliability of both financial and non-financial information, including reports such as the 100R, the annual financial report, the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, the capital asset schedule, the debt schedule, and so forth. Compliance objectives are designed to assure adherence to laws and regulations. The State Board of Accounts publishes uniform compliance guidelines in the form of manuals, bulletins, and directives. Examples would be timely and accurate recording of transactions or the accounting for capital assets. The statutes also contain many provisions to follow. Some of those areas include the deposit and investment of funds, reconciling bank accounts, public purchase laws, public works laws, the claims laws, and so forth. As you set up your internal control system, consider how you can provide reasonable assurance that these laws and regulations will be complied with. These objectives categories are interrelated and therefore they may overlap. For example, the acquisition, safeguarding, disposition, and accounting for capital assets would encompass all of these objectives. The 5 components of internal control that are vital to a successful system are control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information and communication, and monitoring. Each of the 5 components of internal control is necessary to form a complete internal control process. The control environment sets the tone of the organization and influences the effectiveness of internal controls within the government. Many factors determine the control environment, including the governing body's stated values and participation in the process. We have several examples of procedures which you may want to consider for your city or town, starting on page 2-1. One example would be an organizational chart or an outline of specific duties within your city or town. Risk assessment is the process used to identify, analyze, and manage potential risks to the governmental entity's objectives. Certain activities have a greater potential for loss from fraud or misappropriation. For example, the handling of cash has a much higher inherent risk for theft than a data entry activity. Other high-risk areas would be receipts and disbursements, including payroll and credit cards. Once risks are identified and assessed, control activities should be developed to minimize those risks. Control activities detect, prevent, or reduce the identified risks that interfere with the achievement of objectives. Examples of these activities include reconciliations, authorizations, and approval processes. An integral part of the control activity component is segregation of duties. However, in very small governmental units, such segregation may not be practical. In this case, compensating activities should be implemented. Section 2, pages 8 to 14, contain many ideas for control activities that you may want to consider for your city or town. Procedures related to the component of information and communication should provide for an exchange of information within the government and with external parties. Examples of procedures to include the requirement to document communications with the State Board of Accounts and to verify that required reports are accurate and timely. Internal communication allows for two-way communication between supervisors and staff regarding the responsibilities and resolution of issues. And finally, monitoring activities allow management to assess the quality of internal controls over time and make adjustments as necessary. One common form of monitoring is to do periodic checks to determine if controls are in place and working effectively. So to summarize, a sound internal control system is purposeful and provides reasonable assurance that the political subdivision will accomplish its mission and objectives with accountability and transparency. As you can see, a system of internal control may be implemented in many different ways. Because cities and towns vary in size and complexity, no single method of internal control is universally applicable. However, the 5 internal control components should be present and functioning, operating in an integrated manner. Internal control should be regularly evaluated and adapted to meet the needs of your city or town. We have much more information of these components in Section 1 of the manual, and many examples and ideas for you to explore in Section 2 of the manual, so please review those sections when you have a chance. Now that we've had an overview of internal controls, Todd will continue with ideas and suggestions on how to get started.
So when you're looking at internal controls, and maybe you've not done anything in that aspect to this point, you need to realize you've already got some controls in place, and maybe you just don't realize it. For example, did you write a receipt when the last customer came in and paid their water bill? You know, if you did, that's a control. Or did you do a bank reconciliation last month? That's another control. Did you lock the office last night when you left work? That's also a control. So we're not talking about reinventing the wheel. To get started, take a look at what you're already doing. Many of the things you currently do because they're required by statute or by State Board of Accounts guidelines are controls themselves, and I've just mentioned a couple. When you start to take a look at what you're currently doing, document your procedures and controls. Get things in writing, make a list. This information you can provide to the field examiners when they come to do the audit. And having it in written form will help complete some of the information that we ask for prior to an audit starting. The forms that we send you, like our Form 7, 9, and 45. These forms require you to provide us with certain information on your internal controls. So if you've got them written and in electronic format, you can easily copy and paste from your document to our forms that we're asking for, and that might make completing them a little easier. Next, establish a control environment. This is the culture, values, and expectations your municipality will put into place. You've probably heard us say before, setting the tone at the top. It's implementing and promoting ethical standards, integrity, and accountability policy. Usually by a governing body or the top, that's done by setting mission, goals, and objectives so the unit knows what it is to accomplish. Establish structure, organizational responsibilities, and reporting chains. Hire competent and trustworthy staff members to provide necessary training for them. Provide leadership and good governance by staying on top of operations and performance and correcting problems when identified. Emphasize that compliance with laws and regulations is the expectation for your organization. Assure that the goals and objectives are clear and not in competition with each other or compliance requirements. And hold people accountable for their responsibilities. Once you've done the preliminary documentation of what you currently do and created a control environment, review and analyze what your current controls are and see what areas might need some improvement. For example, do you have one person that's doing several things? Maybe you can separate or assign some of those activities to another person. Do you not have a process for reviewing the bank reconciliation? If you don't have that currently, you'll need to add a control there. And look for areas that need improvement and assess the risk of not taking it a step further. What you're doing here is assessing risk. It's one of those 5 components. Risk assessment identifies internal and external risks to the achievement of objectives and then determines how it will be managed. Is it a risk your unit is willing to accept, or are you going to implement controls to lower the risk? After you've done that in areas that are weak, develop and implement controls. Also, evaluate what resources you have and don't have. Are there 5 people in the city controller's office? Or is there only one person in the clerk treasurer's office, that being the clerk treasurer themselves? Do you have a computerized accounting system? Is it old or a newer version? Or do you have hand-posted records? So based on the resources, evaluate what duties your office has and how to assign tasks to staff. Obviously, the more staff that you have available, the more duties that you can segregate. Since employees will have different skill sets, you'll want to assign duties to staff who are capable of handling such tasks. So consider, do some staff members have secondary education or enhanced skills, more experience than others? These are things to consider in designing your internal controls in not only your office, but in other departments or offices in your municipality, like the Parks Department, Police Department, utilities. Those departments need to be aware of these types of things also. And finally, after you've looked at what controls you already have, you documented it in writing, you addressed weaknesses, and design more controls based on what resources you have. The next thing you can do is communicate it with officials and employees. Provide copies of the written procedures, have training sessions, get acknowledgments from the employees that they've received copies of the procedures or handbooks, and communicate what controls are in place, how each person is responsible for fulfilling and adhering to the controls, what's going to happen to them if they don't follow the designated protocol, etc. Finally, don't forget procedures to monitor the controls you've designed and are implementing. This will be the mechanism to ensure you're working toward getting your objectives met by seeing that the things you've said should be done are in fact being done. Part of that is determining if those objectives and goals are being met. If not, you need to assess why not and what needs to be changed or modified in order to get you where you want to be. It involves splitting responsibilities for bookkeeping, deposits, reporting, and approving. The further duties are separated, the less chance any single employee has of committing a fraudulent act. For smaller governmental units with only a few accounting employees, sharing responsibilities between 2 or more people or requiring critical tasks to be reviewed by coworkers can serve the same purpose. Many prevent controls are based on the concept of separating duties. Examples are including prohibiting the same person from conducting related transactions, such as initiating and recording transactions, or making purchases and approving those payments, or ordering and accepting inventory, or approving vendors and making payments, receiving bills and approving payments, and authorizing returns and issuing refunds. Payroll preparation and distribution duties and approving, writing and signing checks should also be done by different people when possible. Some examples of internal controls built around the concept of authorization, approval, and verification include for payroll, requiring supervisory review and approval of payroll information before disbursement, requiring interdepartmental dual authorization of payroll data by accounting and human resource departments, and for non-payroll, requiring prior approval of credit customers, vendors, and purchases. Proper segregation of duties dictates that duties will be separated so that no single person is authorizing, recording, and maintaining custody of a transaction. We oftentimes hear from units that segregation of duties is just not possible. Many times, the reason for that is because there's only one person in the financial office. Other times, it's no one else, like the council member is willing to get involved. In these cases, you need controls to compensate for not being able to segregate duties. Compensating controls are less desirable than segregation of duties. Segregation of duty internal control, because compensating controls generally occur after the transaction is complete. Also, it takes more resources to investigate and correct errors and to recover losses than it does to prevent those errors in the first place. The compensating control can limit the severity of not having true segregation of duties due to the lack of available financial office employees, like those only having one person in that office. To have a mitigating effect, the compensating control should operate at a level of precision that would prevent or detect and correct a material misstatement. Most common example in units where the number of employees is limited would be for the bank reconciliation, where one person performs it and another person reviews it. The person reviewing it could be a council member, a designated employee outside of the accounting office, the fiscal officer of a neighboring governmental unit, or financial consultants, etc. This review would include the complete bank statement and canceled checks or the optical images that you receive. And as with any internal control procedure, you want documentation that the control is being executed. So we would want to see, in this case, documentation that the bank reconciliation was completed and that someone reviewed it, either by initials or signing or an email or some documentation that they've done that. For the annual financial report, in smaller units, the fiscal officer is entering the information into Gateway, submitting the report, as well as the one who probably has been posting everything all year. So to compensate for this, a secondary person should be reviewing and approving the annual report. And again, you're going to want to document that approval. Another common one is revenue reports. The fiscal officer, who in a small unit is most likely receiving money, depositing it, and posting it, could compile a listing of all receipts for a month, for example, or it could be a week, and have a secondary person review that. The secondary person could compare the listing to deposits on the bank statement compared to receipts from the prior month to see if it's in the same ballpark or not, or even look at the same month from the prior year, and so the receipts should be somewhat similar, or if not, an explanation provided. And again, finally, with that one, you're going to want to document. Internal controls are policies. Internal controls are policies or procedures put into place to provide reliable financial information, promote efficient and effective operations, ensure policy compliance, and safeguard assets. For example, when you came to work this morning, did you lock the doors to your house? If so, that's an example of an internal control you use to protect the assets that you own. Controls can be preventative, designed to discourage errors, irregularities, or intentional fraud from occurring. Many prevent controls are based on the concept of segregating duties. When you locked your doors this morning, you are preventing anyone from just walking in undetected. Controls can also be detective, designed to detect errors or irregularities after they occur. For example, reviewing the monthly bank reconciliation to ensure bank activity and balances agree to your ledgers, and investigating any unusual transactions. This can discover errors before they become big problems. On the example of your home, if you install the security system, it should detect if someone enters when the system is engaged. Internal control provides a check and balance system over operations, promoting orderly, economical, efficient, and effective operations, as well as promote adherence to laws, regulations, contracts, and management directives. They safeguard resources against loss due to waste, abuse, mismanagement, errors, and fraud, and develop and maintain reliable financial and management data, and accurately present this data in timely reports. What don't internal controls do? Well, the first thing is they don't catch everything. The best design controls shouldn't be viewed as being your safety net. You still need to review, modify, and change controls as situations in your unit shift or change. If someone really wants to steal, for example, they usually find a way to do that. Internal controls might not catch it right away, but if it's designed effectively, it will at least alert management to the situation before things spiral out of control. Internal controls provide reasonable but not absolute assurance that the organization's objectives will be achieved. They don't result just because you have a lot of policies or procedures. And internal controls are based on a strong control environment and solid business practices that, in most cases, will be supported by policies. However, lack of formal policies does not preclude good business practices. And lastly, they don't always work. The controls you implement today, when you monitor and evaluate the results, may not help you reach your objectives and goals. Internal controls are fluid and ever-changing, so if you find your controls aren't working as intended, you need to reassess, make some changes, and implement new controls. We get questions a lot of times about what an internal control policy or procedures looks like. What does the physical document look like? Well, here are some links to some examples that I found. The first three municipalities, when I looked online, that had Indiana in their name. There are others. I just did a Google search, and you could do it too for something like Indiana City Internal Control Policy or Indiana Municipality Internal Controls. That'll get you some results to look at. For the three that you see here, I did not review to see that they covered the necessary areas or anything like that. I just looked to see that they were in writing and used them so that you could see some examples of what documented internal control policies look like. I found a couple of others outside of Indiana. These are from Tennessee. One is from a town of around 13,000 in population, and the other was a larger town population of approximately 80,000. So they are unique in their controls, even though they're both towns, but looking at them should help you see the differences between a large government and a smaller one. Here are some other links that you might find useful. The first one is an internal control toolkit for municipal governments. It's from a manual from the University of Tennessee's Municipal Technical Advisory Service, or MTAS, and downloads into a PDF file. It's geared towards compliance with laws in Tennessee, but the basic methods would generally apply to Indiana governments. The others listed here are from a variety of sites we found by doing simple Google searches for internal control related items and might help you in putting together and documenting your internal control policies and procedures. This final site is a vendor that sells templates and similar items to put together or compile for you your internal control policies and manuals. What it looked like is some of the information you would fill out, and then you hit a button and it kind of put it into a Word document for you. But that does come with a price. But even if you're not interested in purchasing it, you might want to check out the website, because I could see a lot of information that was free on internal controls, and so that might help you getting started. It showed some brief examples of how your policies would look after you input some of the data into those spreadsheets that you see and everything like that. So you might want to check that one out too. With that, I'll turn it back over to Susan for more discussion, and this time on some case study.
What we'd like to do now is to provide some illustrations on when internal control systems work, and also what happened when internal control systems were not present. We have 4 examples for each one of those, one in the area of payroll, one for bank reconciliations, receipts, and credit cards. Our hope is that this will encourage you that internal controls do matter and that they do work as set up properly. In our first example, a payroll clerk decided to pay herself more than the amount stated in the salary ordinance. In this unit, internal controls were put in place to have a second person review all payments made through the payroll system to make sure that the amounts paid were in agreement with the salary ordinance. Their policy stated that inconsistencies were to be reported to the fiscal officer. In this case, the reviewer noticed that the payroll clerk received payment in excess of the ordinance amount, and that inconsistency was reported to the fiscal officer. Upon investigation, the fiscal officer verified the overpayment was made, and steps were taken to correct that situation. In this case, the unit had determined that payroll claims were an area of risk. This is not uncommon. If you've attended past State Board of Accounts conferences, you know that payroll is a common avenue for someone to misappropriate funds. Because the unit had determined that this was an area of risk, it set up a review process where one person outside of the payroll process was to review payroll claims to make sure that the payments were made in accordance with the salary ordinance. The unit also set up a process for the reviewer to report any inconsistencies. The person who noted the inconsistency had a line of communication to the fiscal officer to report issues, and that person followed the procedures to notify the fiscal officer without delay. The fiscal officer had a line of communication to the governing body. The exchange of information allowed for a quick resolution to the issue before it became worse. In this case, internal control procedures allowed the unit to detect the issue and provided a method of communication to the responsible official so that it could be stopped. In the manual, there are several ideas for you to consider in the area of control activities for the payroll process. These ideas are in the training materials section, section 2, starting on page 8. In fact, there are 15 ideas listed to try and help you get started in this process. You will need to determine which ones would be appropriate for your unit. For example, would it be practical for salary and wage rates to be verified by someone outside of the payroll process? Or for payroll disbursements to be reviewed and approved by an authorized individual prior to payment? Or for access to payroll applications to be controlled by user logins and passwords? Internal controls over payroll do matter. Just this month, we had a report filed where an official paid himself $3,750 in excess of the budgeted amount of compensation. In the last year, we have issued special investigation reports detailing significant amounts of overpaid compensation. So the question to ask is, what procedures can you put in place to protect your city or town from improper payroll transactions? A bookkeeper noticed that some checks on the bank statement had amounts she did not recognize and checks that she did not remember issuing. She immediately communicated this discrepancy and the bank was contacted. After reviewing the images of the checks, it was determined that someone printed checks to look just like the unit's check with the correct routing and account information on it. They presented the fraudulent checks to several banks in the area and cashed them. The loss was several $1,000s, but the good news is the bank reimbursed the account. In this situation, if a bank reconciliation had not been performed as required by statute, the unit would have been at risk for incurring additional theft or for not reporting the theft in time for the bank to reimburse the account. Because this fiscal officer was performing timely bank reconciliations and keeping her records up to date, she was able to identify these fraudulent checks and notify the bank on time. As far as the internal control components go, a bank reconciliation is required by statute and is considered a control activity that detects unusual or unauthorized financial transactions. Minimum internal control standards recommend that a bank reconciliation be performed by someone outside of the receiving and disbursing process. But if that is not possible for your town, then a review process is recommended. There are several other procedures for you to consider in Section 2, starting on page 10 of the manual. A common procedure for small offices includes having the monthly reconcilement reviewed by the governing body, including a review of the optical images of checks and deposits, plus an analysis of electronic payments. In the last year, our office has issued several charge reports showing unauthorized cash withdrawals, checks made payable to cash, use of counter checks, and other types of personal or unsupported financial activity that could have been caught if a bank reconciliation would have been performed or reviewed by someone outside of the disbursing process. In this example, certain fees were collected by a department and remitted to the fiscal officer. As part of the internal control procedures, the fiscal officer analyzed the revenues and compared the amount received over a certain period, like a reasonableness test. She noticed a significant decline in fees and contacted our office as well as law enforcement. The person in charge of collecting those fees immediately resigned. It was found during the audit that an employee had taken over $12,000 in money not deposited. As you consider the risk assessment component, there is always a risk that receipts will not be deposited. If you look through the special investigation reports filed this year, you will read about literally thousands and thousands of dollars that were not deposited. And in each one of those reports, it was noted that internal control procedures had not been established. So a couple of questions you can ask. Do you know how much money is being collected or how much should be collected? Do you know who is collecting the money on behalf of your city or town? And are you sure it's making it to the bank? In the manual, section 2, we have several ideas of procedures you can consider for the control activity component. A fiscal officer's monthly analysis of credit card claims indicated that personal purchases had been made. The fiscal officer had assigned a person in her office to verify that every disbursement listed on the credit card statement was supported by a store receipt and that the purchases appeared to be for government purposes. This procedure was performed every month. During her review one month, 2 problems were noted. One credit card disbursement did not have supporting documentation. Another disbursement did have supporting documentation, but the list of items purchased included personal expenses. The individual responsible for this review immediately notified the fiscal officer. The employee paid back the money, and the situation was resolved. This is a great example of being vigilant in establishing the internal control procedures and following through. We have numerous special investigation reports over personal credit card purchases. This unit avoided that by instituting procedures that detected the problem and provided a mechanism to put a stop to it immediately. Again, we have lots of information available to you on our website about establishing credit card policies and procedures. There are also ideas in section 2 of the internal control manual for you to consider, both in the area of disbursements and specifically in regard to credit card purchases. As far as the time when internal controls were not in place, we had a report filed last October where over $97,000 in disbursements were made for the benefit of a government official. If you would like an example of something more recent, just this month we had a report of disbursements in excess of $30,000 for personal gain. So internal controls do matter. As part of this presentation, we want to make sure that you're aware of this statute, Indiana Code 511-127. If either by the working of your internal controls or for some other reason, you discover an unexplained material variance, loss, shortage, or theft, then you must report that to our office. The materiality of those situations will be defined by your city or town's materiality threshold policy. If you ever have actual knowledge or reasonable cause to believe that there has been a misappropriation of public funds, you're required to send written notice to our agency and to the county prosecutor. A misappropriation of public funds is always reported, as it is not subject to a materiality threshold. Now, how you can do that is you can go to our website, and if you go to the cities or towns page and scroll to the bottom, you'll find the heading Responsibilities under 511-127, and you can enter the information here. We do want to touch on some common audit findings in relation to the internal controls. Our field examiners will look at your internal controls when they come in to do an audit, so it is a good idea to have your procedures written out and to have a mechanism to document that the procedures are being performed. The most common audit findings we see are that the unit did not separate incompatible activities related to receipts, disbursements, and payroll, or have a compensating control, such as a review process for a small office. We also see that a unit did not have a review or approval process over the bank reconciliation or over the financial close and reporting, and the examples of that would be the 100R or the annual financial report. Also, we see that the unit did not provide evidence of an oversight, review, or approval process. In other words, the internal controls may have said that person B was to review the bank reconciliation, but there was no way of knowing whether person B actually performed that task because the review was not documented. So those are some things to look at in the internal controls that you set up for your city or town. So based on these case studies and common audit findings, you can see that internal controls are fundamental to the accounting and integrity of public funds. We cannot overemphasize the importance of establishing internal controls and the effect those controls have on the achievement of your city or town's objectives, as well as your audit. We encourage you to review the internal control manual, establish procedures which address all 5 components, and update those procedures as necessary. If you have any questions, we would be happy to address those now.
There are no questions as of right now, but there is a delay. So if you have a question, please submit it, and we'll just do wrap up comments. And if there are any questions at that point, we will take them.
Let's show more. Yeah, so there's our contact information again. If after this you need to speak with one of us, you can call the number, or you can email cities.towns@fua.in.gov, and we'll be happy to try to help you with your question.
Great, thank you. I just have a few concluding remarks, so please hang on a bit longer, and this gives you an opportunity to submit your question if you have one. Thank you very much for your time and expertise, Todd and Susan. Your presentation was extremely valuable to our members. As I mentioned, I will be sending out a recorded link of the webinar later this week, and you will receive 1 MMI credit for attending this webinar once we review attendance. We did have a question come in. What is the role of the Oversight Committee?
The Legislative Body Oversight Committee. The Oversight Committee would be designated individuals that would review the internal controls that are put in place or make suggestions for internal controls to be put in place, and also be setting the tone for the organization.
Okay, great. Thank you. And as Todd and Susan did give their contact information, if you do have any more questions that come up, you are welcome to contact them directly. The next AIM webinar is on easements and will be on August 15th. Registration is available online at aimindiana.org. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day.